Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar today on higher education policy and the states. Thank you to the Education Commission of the States for hosting this webinar and for the National Conference of State Legislatures for joining us today. I'm Tom Harness, Director of State Relations at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, a national association of 400 public colleges and universities nationwide. This webinar will review the actions made by states in 2017 pertaining to higher education. Coming off the 2016 election, while most of the nation's attention turned to the new administration in Washington, states had significant and diverse challenges that needed to be addressed by governors and legislatures. From transportation to healthcare, from the environment to combating drug abuse, states had busy legislative calendars in 2017. Higher education was no exception to this. Higher education is constitutionally a responsibility of state government, and state leaders addressed perennial issues this year, such as college affordability, economic and workforce development, and immigration, as well as emerging issues such as campus free speech and state-level solutions to student debt. Our panelists today will discuss these issues. Our panelists include Dylan Opalich, Assistant Director of State Relations at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, Neil Holly, Assistant Director, Post-Secondary and Workforce Development Institute at the Education Commission of the States, Lawrence Cisneros, Policy Analyst at the Education Commission of the States, and Dustin Whedon, Senior Policy Specialist at the National Conference of State Legislatures. We will be discussing a wide variety of state legislative activities affecting higher education, and we encourage you to participate in this webinar. Please write the questions in the chat box, and we will answer as many questions as we can in the final 15 minutes of the presentation. We also encourage you to participate on Twitter using the hashtag HELegReview. Our first presenter today will be Dustin Whedon, Senior Policy Specialist at the National Conference of State Legislatures, who will start with state appropriations.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Neil, from the Education Commission of the States for hosting us today. I have the great pleasure of talking about two of the most exciting and most popular higher education topics today. I'm going to start by talking about state trends in higher education policy, or state trends in appropriations, and continue my comments with focusing on student debt. So we're going to jump right in. I want to start by kind of providing some context within state budgets and also historically for where higher education appropriations fit in. And this chart right here, the three pie graphs are probably look very similar to everybody, and the trends that we see here are not unknown to most people probably listening today. So if we look, going back to fiscal year 1992, higher education expenditures accounted for about 13% of total state general fund expenditures. And we fast forward to 2018, the higher education portion is down to about 9% now. But also within this, you kind of see the significant growth in Medicaid from 11% of general fund expenditures to 22%. But also I want to just point out very briefly that between 2004 and 2018, total education spending, if you add up the portion of general fund expenditures allocated to higher education and K-12 education, has been down since the recession. And I will be talking a little bit about some of these trends. So moving on to, there we go. So if we look at higher education in comparison to the other major budget categories for the change in the current fiscal year for the budgets that were just enacted this year, we see that higher education actually increased nationally by about a little over 4%. And when you take higher education in isolation, a 4% increase is actually not too bad. I mean, first of all, it's positive. Second of all, it's above the rate of inflation. But when you put it in the context of the other major budget categories, you see that higher education spending actually lagged by about 2 percentage points the other major categories. But when we look at higher education trends, year-over-year growth in higher education spending, we see that for the last several years, higher education spending has been growing at about 4.5% up until 2017. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in 2017, but we do see the rebound in higher education spending in 2018. but there's significant variation between states. And this map shows the change in state funding from 2017 to 2018. So the red states are where there were year-over-year decreases in higher education funding, and the green states are where there are increases in funding. There are a couple states who just recently passed budgets and were not included yet, and Wyoming actually had flat funding for higher education. But when you consider the difficult year that fiscal year 17 was, and several states actually had small increases from fiscal year 17 to 18. But if you go back to 2016, they're actually expected to spend less this year than they were 2 years ago. And now I kind of want to just return back to why fiscal year 17 was such a difficult year and kind of wrap up this discussion about the state appropriations component. And really what was happened in 2017 is a number of states faced mid-year budget shortfalls. Almost half the states had to close a budget shortfall mid-year. And this also kind of carried over in a number of states to the fiscal year 2018 budgets that were just enacted. So it's been a pretty tight budget year in the last couple of years in a number of states. So this slide really kind of addresses why that is. We've seen sluggish revenue growth in state tax revenues really since the recession ended. And this is somewhat abnormal in recovery periods. If you look at historical recovery periods, like the most recent recovery has been fairly steady, but sluggish. It's lagged behind other recovery periods. So it's taken much longer for state revenues to recover. And part of the reason, especially last year, was that sales taxes were unexpectedly slow and also very volatile. And this led to, and so a number of the 22 states that had to close mid-year budget gaps, a large reason was that their sales tax collections were not meeting expectations. And of course, there's increased demand in other areas, especially Medicaid spending, and also pensions are also a major factor in state budgets now. And also, I just want to hit on that last one very quickly because we just recently saw that the tax proposal, Trump administration's tax proposal, has been announced finally. A number of states have actually seen challenges in their revenue streams because people are holding on to investments and waiting to find out what happens at the national level to see if there's going to be tax reform. If there are lower tax rates, and they want to hold on to their investments until they can sell their investments and have a lower tax rate in the future. So next I want to turn to student debt. And this first slide is going to show the growth in the number of bills addressing student loan issues and student debt in some capacity. So when you look at this chart, it's important to compare the odd number of years to each other and then compare the even number of years to each other. And we see pretty significant growth in the number of bills being introduced each year. And this is really, I think, matches, commentary in the media, commentary that state legislators hear from their constituents. There's concern that borrowers are delaying starting families, not saving for retirement, not buying homes or cars, major purchases. And these are all reaching back to legislators. And so there's an increased interest among states to address the student debt concerns. So there's really 4 areas that I've grouped student debt legislation into: consumer protection, education, economic development, prevention. I'm going to talk about the first 3, and then when I turn it over to Neil, he's going to get into many of the financial aid reforms that have been enacted and really address some of the concerns about preventing loans from happening in the first place. So on the consumer protection side, there's really 2 major areas that states have focused their attention. The first is Student Loan Bill of Rights, or licensing of loan servicers, and the other is counseling programs for delinquent borrowers. A couple of states now have pilot programs that are targeted to a population of borrowers that often gets forgotten about. These are the people who are already struggling to repay their loans. So if we look at the consumer protection role, in 2017, this map shows where there was legislation related to loan servicing. And what I'm really talking about loan servicing is states are introducing legislation to license loan servicers. And in every state, this includes the loan servicers that service the federal loans as well as private loans. And the reason this is becoming kind of a hot topic is that states are actually responsible for licensing and regulating other forms of consumer credit. So it's a natural extension for states to start looking at student loans when the student loan market has expanded so much. There's actually two components to most of the student loan bill of rights. The first is the ombuds position, and the second is the servicing component. And most of the loan servicing bills are really focused on what you would consider pretty standard consumer protections to ensure that borrowers are not defrauded or misled, payments are not misapplied, and the correct information is submitted to credit bureaus. Then we move on to the education role. There's a lot of action in this space, and a lot of it is related to providing better or more information to borrowers, in particular, also requiring financial literacy curricula in high schools to include a student loan component. There's also interest in expanding the student loan or financial literacy component to colleges, although that's much more difficult to do legislatively. But I want to focus probably most of my time on this slide talking about the borrowing notification letters, because this has been the area where there's been the most active number of bills enacted. In fact, 5 states enacted bills related to notifying borrowers of their loan obligations on an annual basis. This idea actually started in Indiana a couple of years ago, and then Nebraska and Wisconsin picked up on it last year. And then Florida, Maryland, Oregon, Texas, and Washington all passed bills this year. And these letters are pretty standard, or pretty straightforward, and all the bills are pretty standard, and that they require institutions to estimate the total amount students have borrowed, the potential loan payoff amount, estimate a monthly amount, and then also how close the borrower is to the federal loan limit. And the idea is just a fairly low-cost option to the state that they can increase knowledge about how much students are borrowing. And then finally, I just want to talk about what I really have called the economic development role of student debt policy. And this is really considers very targeted tax credits, forgiveness and loan repayment programs. And I also include loan refinancing in this category. This is actually where the most number of bills are introduced each year, especially the forgiveness and repayment programs tend to be the most common. They're also very targeted. Some of these target doctors serving rural areas, the agricultural sector, aviation sector. There's a whole wide range where these types of programs have popped up. Usually only about 1 or 2 get enacted each year. But where we've seen the most significant growth is actually in the tax credit and deduction category. And there's a couple of trends here. First of all, just the increased number of bills and interest in providing tax deductions and credits, but also including employers who pay monthly payments for their employees, including employers in the tax credit component. And so this year, there's been kind of like a steady increase in the number of states enacting tax credits. And this year, Minnesota passed a tax credit for individuals that maxes out at $500. And with that, I believe I'm going to turn it over to Neil, who's going to talk to us about workforce developments and some financial aid policy.
Thank you, sir. Let's start off by thanking everybody for joining us this afternoon and or morning, depending if you're on the West Coast. We really appreciate it. Lauren and I are going to talk about some financial aid and campus safety issues that we saw this year. I'm going to start off by discussing actually some recent workforce legislation, because I think it's relevant to the financial aid discussion that's going on right now and emerging trends in state financial aid. One of the biggest bills that made a lot of news this year was the expanding of the Tennessee Promise with the Reconnect Act. This is probably one of the largest adult-focused state aid programs in the country now. We've also saw Florida, Rick Scott, this was actually an executive order, put $85 million into the Florida Growth Fund, which is supporting training in high-demand industries. And we also saw, and this is actually looking back at 2016, the Workforce Ready Scholarship in Kentucky. It targeted industry recognized certificate programs and made aid available for those programs. And this year, kind of following suit, we saw Indiana HB 1008, and that's grant money targeted toward certificate programs in specific areas within the workforce. Reason I wanted to focus in on that, and as a special thanks to Catherine Vesey-White with NASBO, who helped me with some of this information earlier this year, is that where we are seeing new money and financial aid emerge for public higher education, it is around this workforce conversation. This seems, what we've seen, especially in Kentucky and Indiana, seems to be the way of the future where new money is concerned. It's going to be very targeted, not only at the 2-year system, but technical and high demand programs within that sector. General financial aid trends that we observed in 2017, obviously the free college movement is going strong. Lots of bills around that. Lots of bills continue around outcomes-based funding, as I mentioned earlier, and kind of opened up around workforce initiatives. We have many legislatures either during session or during interims and study groups looking at tweaks and redesign of state-based merit and need-based aid. There are beginning to be conversations about aid for CBE and PLA, and also for dual enrollment. But I really, out of all these subjects, I want to do a special focus on free college and outcomes-based funding. At least 24 states introduced legislation concerning free college this year. 46 bills were introduced. Seven bills in 4 states were enacted in Arkansas, Nevada, Oregon, and Tennessee. Rhode Island, which is one of the most recent free college legislation to be passed, has actually been passed as part of the budget, but there's a separate bill that's still in progress, and the Rhode Island legislature is still in session. We saw 15 other bills that advanced but failed or sine die. Outcomes-based funding continues to be a hot topic within legislatures. A lot of what we've seen in most recent years is there have been bills enacted, but usually impacting programs that are already existing with tweaks. When you exclude appropriation bills that mention performance-based funding as existing programs, there were 14 states that considered funding legislation. 34 bills were introduced. 4 bills were enacted in Arkansas, Kentucky, Texas, and Utah, and 1 was vetoed in Florida. And it's important to note that Florida already has an existing performance-based funding formula. Those pieces of the legislation would have made some tweaks, but did not in that program. 24 bills failed and 5 are still pending. All 4 of the enacted bills included equity measures for at-risk or developmentally challenged students. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Lauren.
Great, thank you. I'll be providing the sexual violence legislation and 2017 guns on campus legislation. I'll also provide a review of campus safety legislative trends from 2015 to 2017. In 2015, ECS, in partnership with NASPA, the Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, began tracking higher education campus safety legislation, specifically campus sexual violence bills and guns on campus bills. National surveys and media coverage of high-profile cases of campus sexual violence incidences and gun-related violence in the United States fueled concerns about these 2 top-level campus safety issues. It's important to note that ECS's tracking on campus sexual violence legislation initially included legislative activity in 4 primary policy areas, and that would be defining affirmative consent, clarifying and expanding the role of local law enforcement, creating or expanding requirements of transcript notations, and addressing the role of legal counsel in conduct hearings centered on sexual violence. This year, in 2017, we expanded our tracking for campus sexual violence to also include other issues, including prevention and training related to and reporting of campus sexual violence incidences. So in 2017, based on a review of legislative activity concerning campus sexual violence, we tracked at least 15 states that had considered campus sexual violence legislation, and the map on this slide reflects those states. In those states, at least 53 bills had been introduced, and as of August 9th, 2017, 10 bills were enacted, 20 bills died, and there's 23 bills pending. In 2017, based on a review of legislative activity concerning guns on campus, we tracked at least 18 states that considered guns on campus legislation. And again, here on this slide, you'll see a map that reflects those states. At least 29 bills were introduced in those states, and as of August 9th, 2017, 24 bills died, and we have 2 bills pending. On this slide, you'll see trends for our legislative tracking for both issues from 2015 to 2017. For campus sexual violence, you'll notice an increase of introduced legislation in 2017 due to our expansion of policy areas for campus sexual violence legislative tracking. In 2015, there were 30 pieces of introduced legislation. There were also 30 in 2016, and then in 2017, it increased to 53. Of those pieces of legislation, only 10 bills were enacted in 2015, 8 bills in 2016, and as of August 9th, 2017, 8 bills have been enacted, and 23 bills are pending. For guns on campus, our bill tracking shows an increase of guns on campus introduced legislation from 16 bills in 2015 to 33 bills in 2016, and finally 29 bills in 2017. Of these bills, only 2 were enacted in 2015, 3 in 2016, and so far, 3 bills have been enacted in 2017. In addition, many of the introduced guns on campus bills, 24 bills total, have died in 2017, and only 3 pieces of legislation are pending as of August 9th. ECS plans to continue to examine state legislative developments on these campus safety issues to inform leaders in higher education and state policy. It's important that state decision makers join leaders in the higher education community to engage in discussion about effective approaches to address these issues so that the safety and well-being of our campus communities continue to be a top priority. If you'd like additional information about any of this policy tracking, or any other of our policy issues, you can reach out to our policy team here at ECS. Now I'll go ahead and pass it on to Tom.
Good afternoon, this is Dylan O'Polich from AskU, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the tuition increases we saw for this academic year. And while they are not necessarily byproducts of or direct consequences of the legislative session, they really hinge on what has happened. And so this is just a selection of some major systems and campuses to see the range of tuition increases. And it's important to note that according to College Board, tuition increases have been much more mild in the past few years. With last year, the tuition growth rate slowed to 2.4% for public in-state tuition and fees, compared to the previous 2 years, which was 2.9%. And they will release their new data later this fall. But as you can see, the majority of the tuition increases are mostly accounting for inflation and are not necessarily large increases like we were seeing more close to the Great Recession. And you can see that there are some states or systems that made more significant increases, such as Nebraska, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. And these institutions or these states were also states that received decreased levels of funding in this past legislative session. So there is correlation between the two, and you can see also that a lot of times tuition is used as a bargaining chip between governors, legislators, boards, and institution leaders. It's politically not very ideal to increase tuition, and so oftentimes governors or legislators will encourage an institution to keep the tuition increase as low as possible in return for increased funding the next year, or for some type of just for any type of incentive. And so we're seeing that trend continue while tuition stays relatively, the increases are relatively mild. We also saw some states are still under tuition freezes from previous years. So Wisconsin's system is still under a tuition freeze, and then Maine and Washington made their first increases in a few years coming off of tuition freezes. And I'll hand it over to Tom to talk about DACA.
Yeah, I'd just like to take a few minutes here to talk about immigration policy. This has been a very hot issue nationally with the Trump administration making changes to the DACA program. For those of you who aren't familiar, DACA is not a law. It is an administrative action, and it was created during the Obama era. And because it's an administrative action, we knew that when President Trump took office, that he could, on any day after he took office, decide to discontinue the program. And his administration has pursued that. They have looked to phasing out that program and essentially punted it to Congress to take action on immigration policy. But at the state level, there has been significant action as well. Legislatures in 13 states legislatures have considered 13 bills prohibiting institutions from declaring themselves sanctuary campuses in 7 states. Now, if you look at the very few number of public institutions that have considered themselves sanctuary campuses and actually read what they've produced on it, it really isn't much. There isn't much that public college campuses can do, and candidly, to declare themselves a sanctuary campus is equivalent to writing a check that they just simply can't cash. But some legislatures and governors have noticed this, and legislatures in Georgia, Indiana, and Mississippi have signed bills into law expressly prohibiting sanctuary campuses in their state. In-state tuition for undocumented students. 18 states currently allow undocumented students to receive in-state tuition, while a small number of states, 6 of them, extend financial aid to this population. In 2017, a few states did have discussions about extending in-state tuition to undocumented students. Again, with all immigration policy, it's a very heated debate, but there hasn't been significant action at the state level this year in extending in-state tuition to undocumented students. These bills haven't been signed into law. There are ongoing court cases that have been going in the state courts with respect to students who have DACA status and whether these students are eligible for the in-state tuition rate. And one state where that's going to rule on it at the state Supreme Court level right now is Arizona. So this is definitely an evolving issue and an issue that we are tracking right now. And now I'll turn it over to Dylan to talk about free speech on campus.
So this is an issue that has emerged at an extremely quick rate in the 2017 legislative sessions. There had been a few states that considered only a handful of bills before 2017, but in this year, there were 31 bills introduced in 23 states that have somehow touched free speech on campus. Some of them have been more closely aligned to protecting student journalists or freedom of the press as it relates to students, but the majority have also been about the campus at large. And so the bills have passed, there have been bills that have passed in Colorado, Kentucky, North Carolina, Utah, and Virginia this year. Many of the others are still hanging in the balance and pending. We're seeing that some of this legislation has come directly from outside groups, from the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, and the Goldwater Institute. And some states have used these models directly. The North Carolina bill is the most closely resembled to the Goldwater Institute's proposal. And the majority of these bills will require the creation of a free speech policy by the board or by the state's governance structure. And they are looking for these policies to be, to reaffirm the First Amendment. They are oftentimes restating what the First Amendment and what case law has already reinforced as far as free speech on campus. And the main tenet would be that institutions have some ability to limit events based on time, place, and manner restrictions. And so the legislation that's been introduced just wants this to be reaffirmed. And some of it seeks to restrict the ability for campuses to even have free speech zones. But oftentimes in the bill text, it will then go back to the time, place, and manner restriction. So often not changing too much of what is already allowed on campus by the First Amendment, but just reaffirming the state's concern with protecting and allowing all to exercise their First Amendment right. We are seeing some conversation playing out in the media as well as legislation about limiting campuses from uninviting speakers. Again, this will go back to time, place, and manner restrictions. As if there's undue burden to the institution, they do have some flexibility in limiting who does come to campus. And then the final tenet of these bills that is the most concerning coming from an institution standpoint is the prescription of disciplinary sanctions based on violating another's First Amendment rights. And some of these bills, in North Carolina was one in particular, just up until the end, it had included some text around very strict disciplinary sanctions, and we believe that this should really be left up to the institution based on the situation, and that we're not looking for that to be in legislation. And North Carolina actually ended up really softening their bill to exclude some of these disciplinary sanctions. But overall, this has been an issue that has just emerged at a rapid rate, and we expect that this will continue, and that for states who introduce bills this year, they will continue to do so, or will look again in 2018 for more movement. And I'll hand it over to Tom, sorry.
Okay, and so just looking ahead here to 2018, each state, of course, is different. They're in different circumstances, economically, politically. I would say nationwide right now, the political environment is very conservative. The state power held by Republican legislators is at the highest level that it's been in nearly 100 years. So the environment at the state level is conservative. That said, for some states on the coast, some very populous states like California and New York, they have more, in some states in the Northeast, they have more liberal legislatures and some governors who are more progressive. So, but overall, at the state level at least, the mood is very conservative. These issues at the state level are going to continue in 2018. The perennial issues of college affordability, student access to higher education, how our posture towards undocumented students at the state level, those are all going to continue at this to bubble up in the state legislatures. And some states, of course, will continue to confront significant budget challenges. There are already some states who have looked at 2018 and said that budget cuts are very likely to come down, including budget cuts for higher education. But it will vary tremendously based on state. The states that are hurting right now are states that are disproportionately dependent on revenue from oil and natural gas and other coal and other commodities. So, and some of the agricultural-based states as well. 2018 is going to be a very, very big election. Of course, at the national level, there'll be many senators up for re-election and many members of the U.S. House of Representatives. But at the state level, the majority of the nation's governors, 36 of them, will be up for re-election in 2018. And governors hold disproportionate sway on all policy issues at the state level, but higher education is definitely one of them. And they can really set the tone and the agenda for the legislative calendars in their states. But it's beyond that, though, that beyond the fact that 36 legislators or 36 governors are going to be up for re-election, there's going to be state senators and members of state assemblies or state houses that are going to be up for re-election as well. But the 2018 elections are going to be important because they're going to, the people that are being elected in 2018 and taking office in 2019, many of them are going to write the district lines for state legislative districts as well as congressional districts after the 2020 census. And so that's going to be pivotally important for power at the state level and at the federal level as well. So this 2018 election could really have repercussions, not just for the next 2 years or the next 4 years, but for at least the next 10 years. So with that, we have time for questions. Feel free to put questions into the question box. We're also taking questions on Twitter at the hashtag HE Higher Ed. Higher Ed Review. So are there any questions at all?
This is Neil Holly from ECS. A couple people have asked if the slides will be available. We are recording this presentation and it will be available on the ECS website in a couple of days. And what I will do is I will send an email out to all the registrants giving you access to that presentation.
Any states? Any states planned on?
Could we get somebody just ask a question about Excelsior, and if you could give us a little bit more detail about that, because
I think maybe they're talking about the last dollar scholarships. If other states are looking at that at the four-year sector, I know in many at the community college level are looking at the last dollar scholarship. But have you seen any at the four-year level as well?
We haven't seen any last dollar scholarships at the 4-year level yet. There are individual institutions that are leveraging institutional aid to offer last dollar scholarships. And depending on how low the tuition is in low tuition states, low tuition high aid states, that tuition need is usually met just with the state's financial aid package. So that kind of does act as a quasi last dollar amount.
And there was a question on DACA related bills this year. I haven't seen, I mean, there are obviously a lot of bills been introduced at the state level regarding immigration, but I think after the move by the administration, have we seen significant action at the state level? I haven't seen that yet, but I think many people are watching right now to see what Congress does on this issue.
So we had a question about free college, primarily meaning last dollar scholarship programs. And is there any movement or interest in making them first dollar scholarship programs? I would say at the state level, there have been proposals to offer first dollar scholarships, but they've been very few of those, and they tend to not advance very far and actually not even get hearings to move through the legislative process. The big challenge with the first dollar programs is the cost to the state. And that's why so many states have done the last dollar program, is because actually the federal government is going to be picking up the tab for most of the new students entering their higher education schools. So I do think that the notion of living expenses is starting to resonate more with state legislators, that the costs are more than just tuition. So that conversation is starting to pick up a little bit, very slowly. So it's something that a few years from now you might start to see more of, but I would say right now they're very focused on last dollar.
And I would also say the other shoe that can drop on the last dollar scholarships is changes in federal policy, especially with Pell. If there are changes made to Pell, significant changes made to Pell, that could have some pretty significant effects on existing last dollar scholarships like the Tennessee Promise, and how much those awards, how far that money will go to help students.
Okay, so are there any policies on the horizon that didn't fall into the categories you discussed here? I would say that there's a lot of issues. Dual enrollment is one that we didn't get to, but there's just a whole plethora of issues that don't necessarily fall into these categories, but are important at the state level.
Absolutely, I think we're seeing the graying between high school and college in a new and unique way, between CTE programs at the institute, at the high school level, and between community colleges. Special emphasis on adult students. One of the areas that we were working on right now at ECS, and we'll have a paper out on next month, is adult aid for college students. For most states to meet their degree goals for 2020 or 2025 or 2027, depending on which state, you're not going to get there with just traditional age students. You're going to need a significant population of adult students to meet that goal. And right now, there are just not a lot of aid available to part-time adult students. So I think that is an issue now and will become a trend in the future.
There's a question now on performance-based funding. For those states considering legislation, performance incumbent funding for public universities, what are some of the selling points you guys have seen for states that have approved it, and the stumbling blocks in the states where it has stalled?
Well, that's a great question. This is Neil from ECS again. Nick Hellman and company just published a new paper today focused on Tennessee and Ohio. Is Tennessee and Ohio correct?
I believe it's.
Yeah, and those states have the most appropriation invested in performance-based funding. And really what they found in this newest research is that there's only a significant advantage of performance-based funding having an effect on students that were earning certificates. And so there's a lot of debate in the community on how impactful performance-based funding is overall, especially in states that are using existing funds. There's no new money, so there's not a lot of incentive for institutions to act, particularly around disadvantaged, underrepresented students. I would also add that as far as at the state policy level, there are folks that are believers that, you know, even if it's 5 or 10% of the appropriation, that's still a lever for presidents to go to their staff and to their faculty and use that money to pursue, to increase student success and degree completion. As far as stumbling blocks, the policies range a lot from state to state. And so it's hard to, you're comparing apples to oranges sometimes by the way that the different programs are structured. So it's difficult to say which program or which piece of a program is holding that policy back from succeeding.
Right. And some of these policies can be very complicated. I would say, though, at the state level at least, well, new research has come out showing that some of the shortcomings of performance-based funding, it remains very popular.
Yes. With
state legislatures. It remains very popular with governors. Many of those in the business community as well have been very supportive of performance-based funding. There's also been national foundations who have also weighed in and stated their support for building performance-based funding. Around 30 states now have some form of performance-based funding, and some states it's 1%, all the way up to almost the total amount of the appropriation. So it really varies quite dramatically from state to state, like Neil said. Regarding governing boards and governance changes, Nevada passed the first phase legislation reviewing the Board of Regents from the Nevada Constitution. I would just say with governance changes that this is an issue that in 2017, Nevada, of course, was one of the states. This oftentimes gets talked about at the state level. What is the best way to organize a higher education in the state? What's the best way to hold them accountable? We've had some states. I think the trend now that I see, at least in a few states, is toward the decentralization of higher education and getting away from some of the systems and giving institutions their own governing boards. I think Tennessee was an example of a state that went from a more centralized model to a more decentralized model with campuses getting their own boards. I think flagship campuses in particular really push to have their own boards as opposed to going through a system office.
Yeah, and another trend we've seen legislatively with regard to governance is actually requiring training for the governing board members so that they're better prepared to serve their institutions. And that includes everything from training about budgets to like what the role of a trustee or governing board individual is. A number of states have enacted legislation related to that topic lately.
A quick plug for ECS, we're currently working on a new 50-state database on higher ed governance, and that will be out around the first of next year. It's an update of our 2007 work around governance, but it'll highlight all the different governance structures across the country in higher
Are you seeing any early college, high school initiatives expanding with four-year colleges in any states as a way to address tuition costs with less time in college?
So that's a definite area of growth. I haven't seen those partnerships with four-year institutions. A lot of them have been kind of like trickling down, like Neil mentioned earlier, the grading of high school and post-secondary education that is really becoming an extension of high school. So there are high schools that extend into the 13th and 14th year. And also more partnerships with community colleges, but I haven't seen much at the four-year level.
I think that the growth and expansion of dual enrollment
Right.
is stealing some of the thunder. I think you see, especially some regional early colleges springing up, especially when you have high density, low income populations. But dual enrollment seems to be the path of least resistance in this area to get students college credit while they're still enrolled in high school,
Right.
without the structure and the staff that you need around an early college program.
And I think that those issues like performance-based funding, dual enrollment is incredibly popular with many lawmakers because they see it not only as a way to increase college readiness, but also to help students with college costs. So, there's a question about higher ed reserve fund. Do you have do any other states that are thinking about a higher ed reserve fund?
So there are a few states with reserve funds written into statute. The challenge is how you actually fund them. Most states do not have a dedicated revenue stream for them, so they rely on either extra revenue in a given fiscal year, which most states never have anymore. And the other challenge with them, when we've talked to legislators about creating reserve funds, is the concern that they will be rated at any given time during a bad budget year. Mm-hmm. So the idea is kind of out there. I think there's a lot of challenges in place in how you would fund the reserve fund and how you would utilize it and how you would protect it.
Mm-hmm. And reserve funds, at least at the institutional level, can be controversial in some states. I know Wisconsin is one of them, where the legislature felt that the institutions were hoarding money and then also increasing tuition. So that's we're at the system and institutional level rather at the state level. So other questions, what if any conversations around success measurements for higher education institutions relative to student loan borrowing financial aid, i.e. moving away from CDR and some form of repayment progress measurement? I think that's more of an issue at the federal level, but I haven't seen the states dig into that issue.
Depending, I think where you might see some of that at the state level is not with the legislature, but with the state agencies, the state higher ed coordinating and governing boards as part of their master plans. They may have that as an accountability measure at that level,
right.
Especially around loan default.
Okay. One question, are there any states considering lifting bans on funding for post-secondary courses for incarcerated students? Any updates you can share on education appropriations for corrections educational programs? The one that I've seen that's probably the most prominent was Governor Cuomo's efforts in New York with respect to prisoner education. But I think it's one of those issues, again, that's emerging and that people are starting to talk about some more.
Agreed. Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things. I would say that and apprenticeships during state visits. That's something that people are asking about what other states are doing, and really, it's a thing that people are talking about but not acting on yet.
Okay. There is a question about a capital outlay. You guys talked about budget shortfalls for states and the level of funding support for public universities. What, if anything, have you heard about capital funding? I know in Illinois, some presidents are talking about increasing advocacy around getting more capital funding.
That's a great question. Honestly, we don't hear much about capital funding, at least at NCSL. And I think that's in part because capital funding tends to be about 10 to 12% of overall total higher education funding, and it tends to go through a separate budget process. So unfortunately, I haven't heard much about how it's changing over time. I think if anything, it's been fairly stable to maybe even declining nationally. But yeah, no, I think good question to dig into more.
Yeah. And I would say that with the capital funding is that some of the impetus around the advocacy is the fact that many of these college buildings were built to serve the baby boomer generation in the 1960s and 70s, and many of them are crumbling. And there's a whole backlog of capital projects, not just in higher ed, but elsewhere in the state that need to be addressed. And so I think many higher education leaders have looked to getting substantial private donations to help speed along creating, building new buildings or renovating buildings. I mean, obviously, it's when reaching out to private donors, it's their interest is more in creating a new building as opposed to renovating an existing one.
Or states turn to bond referendums.
Right.
North Carolina, I think a year or two ago, just had a multi-billion-dollar bond referendum that the citizens passed. But that too depends on state climate and the feel for higher ed. And right now, higher ed's not polling very well among some audiences, and so to be able to go out and try to make that pitch could be very difficult in this atmosphere right now.
Yeah, it can be very mixed results depending on the political climate. Some states have had success with bond measures in higher ed, and some bond measures have completely failed. I think New Jersey is one who passed it some years ago, but that was the first big capital investment in higher ed that they've had since, I believe, 1988. So it varies considerably from state to state, but I would say it is a concern for higher education leaders. So we're just about out of time. Are there any last questions? If not, we have our last slide here with our email addresses on it. With our email addresses on it, and feel free to send us emails if you have any questions on any higher education policy issue. And like Neil said, we will have this conversation recorded, and we will be sending it out to all the participants. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. So thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.